Welcome to Lifestyle by Design, helping you solve everyday challenges. I'm Karen Jacobs, a clinical professor in occupational therapy at Boston University and a Brookline Rotarian. And here's my co-host.
Hi, and I'm Andrea Kelso. There's a public concern about violence, but few recognize its effect is of how we treat children. And tonight we're joined by Dr. Ron Goldman, PhD. He's a psychological researcher, speaker, and writer, and he educates the public about creating a more peaceful society by confronting the origins of violence. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldman, for joining us tonight. We're really excited to talk about this and learn what you have to say.
My pleasure to be here.
Thank you. It's such an important issue. So perhaps you can help us understand by providing us an overview of violence in America.
Sure. We are one of the most violent developed countries in the world. Our homicide rate is about 5 times that of European countries, 12 times that of Japan. We have a violent crime about 1 every 15 seconds, and particularly women are vulnerable. This is an amazing statistic. 1 out of 3 women will be assaulted by a domestic partner sometime in adulthood.
Oh, that's scary.
Yeah. Sure, yeah. 1 out of 6 women will be raped. Okay, and now our usual response to these kinds of problems are having more police, better intelligence gathering, which are important, of course, but they don't get us to the root of the problem. And so I like to ask questions like, is violence innate, or is it somehow related to experience? And if we know the answer to something like that, then maybe we can take better action on dealing with the problem. Now, there are, of course, many contributing factors, such as availability of guns, social problems, and other types of social effects like gangs. And those are important to address too, but what I'm saying here is that those are secondary factors. And I'm focusing on primary factors. Now, an example of a primary factor is repressed anger. So if one has repressed anger, one's more likely to be triggered by a secondary factor. And so I think it's important that we bring more attention to the primary factors, because without that, we can sort of be going in an endless cycle, and unfortunately that's a lot of what we've been doing lately.
Right, and so in thinking about these primary factors, how early or what are those signs that you can see early on that gets more to the root of where the issue is coming from?
That's a great question, and there is research that looks at infant behavior and infant feelings, and they have many feelings. Sometimes we don't recognize that about them, but one of them, of course, is anger. And there's research that shows that there's a connection between angry temperament in infants and aggressive behavior at age 7. There's other research that shows that aggressive behavior at age 8 is connected with aggressive behavior all the way to age 30. Wow. Okay, so this strongly suggests to us that the roots, the seeds are planted as early as infancy. And here's one other research result that I think is relevant, and that is someone compared preschool children behavior of American children as compared to French children. Mm-hmm. And what she did was she observed them playing in a playground. And she noticed that the French children, preschool now, playfully touched each other twice as much as the American children. And they exhibited aggressive behavior 1% of the time. This is the French children now. Mm-hmm. The American children exhibited aggressive behavior 29% of the time.
Wow.
Huge difference. Wow. So that strongly suggests that there are cultural factors involved here.
Right, that's happening so early on in their lives, so much more compared to other places.
It really, that's
shocking.
It's very shocking. So,
yeah.
What do you think is contributing to this at this, when we're talking about infants, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What's contributing to this? What are like sort of the early signs that we might see?
Yeah, well, there's some interesting research that gives us some very relevant information here that can help educate us. For example, there's research on monkey behavior. And there was a classic experiment that was done in the 1950s, which is in almost all introductory psychology textbooks. And it was done in an animal laboratory where they had monkeys in cages. And what the experimenter did was he separated newborn monkey infants from their mothers and put them in separate cages. And of course provided food and water, but these infant monkeys couldn't contact their mothers and didn't have any other connection with other monkeys except they could see other monkeys, hear other monkeys, and smell other monkeys, but again, no physical contact. And the result was that as these infant monkeys got older, they started to exhibit aggressive behavior toward normally behaving monkeys. And then, as they got older, if some of them became mothers themselves, then they exhibited aggressive behavior toward their own offspring and wouldn't comfort them if their offspring were crying or needing their attention. So the two significant results here are that the separation from the mother led to the aggressive behavior, and it got passed on to the next generation. So that's really significant. So that's one example of how it gets passed on. I got another perspective on this, and that is cross-cultural research. And here investigators looked at anthropological studies of cultures around the world. And what they were looking for was what cultural practices were associated with peaceful cultures as opposed to violent cultures. A great question, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so what they found that one particular practice could predict with 80% accuracy peaceful or violent tendencies of cultures. And that practice was carrying an infant on the body of the mother throughout the day for the first year of life. So they found that cultures that did that, 80% of the time they were peaceful. So again, we're looking at a cultural practice here which is related to being connected with the mother and having physical contact, and that's very important.
Right.
Because this mother-infant relationship is a primary intimate relationship, and it's the foundation for future relationships. So if we have more attention to that and give that more support, we can really create some significant changes.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And so I wonder, with such importance on the bond between an infant and a mother, and seeing that disruption causing aggressive behaviors later in life, what's causing, you described an example of a lab where they were artificially separated, but I would assume then this is happening every day in our culture. And so how is that happening? Why is it happening?
Like disrupting the mother-infant bonding.
Well, here are four basic factors that contribute to the disruption. One is, of course, separation. There's no physical connection, and that's going to be very disruptive, and particularly if it happens after birth. The next factor would be unmet needs of the infant. And again, the infant needs the mother to help those needs be satisfied. So if the needs aren't satisfied, again, there's a reflection on how can the infant depend on mother and how connected the infant would feel in that way. And then, of course, the usual things like maltreatment and trauma would contribute to disruption of that relationship. And trauma in particular would have, of course, long-term effects, disruptions in feeling responsiveness, possibly repressed anger. So it's very important we pay attention to those four factors. And if they're present, then we get the disruption of the primary relationship, and that can lead to repressed anger, that can lead to, again, in some individuals, we're not saying this is going to be everybody, but in some individuals, they could have a greater likelihood of aggressive behavior, and then a few of those may have a greater likelihood of violent behavior. So we're talking here about, again, having more priority and attention to the mother-infant bond, and this is called attachment in the psychological literature. And there's decades of research on this, going back to the 50s and 60s. And for a long time, this was ignored or resisted, even by the psychological profession itself. Because, psychologists are people, and some of them may have, certain emotional resistances to dealing with some of these very sensitive issues. So the research has told us, and more of it has come out in recent decades, it's told us that the quality of the relationship between the infant and the mother has lifelong impact on the infant's behavior and connections with other people. It's amazing.